I don't work on issues related to income inequality. I work on issues related to international finance. And if I can, I'm planning to give him a hard time. So, Claudio, I'm sorry, Gerardo, let me give background of yours. I'm sure everybody knows you, but let me just say some of the things. Gerardo Esquivel received his PhD in economics from Harvard in 1997. He holds a BA from the National University of Mexico, UNAM, and an MA in economics from the Colegio de Mexico. He's currently professor of economics at the Colegio de Mexico, where he has been since 1998 and is the executive coordinator of research at the Instituto Belisario Domínguez of the Mexican Senate. Previously, he worked as a senior macroeconomics researcher at the Harvard Institute for International Development, that you probably know as HIID. He has also been a consultant for several international organizations, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank. He also received several prizes. He was awarded recently the National Award in Public Finances. He also, in 2012, he received the National Award for Journalism, and also the National Prize for Research in 2005 that is given annually by the Mexican Academy for Sciences. So, Gerardo, we look forward to your talk, and thanks for coming. You'll have about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here at Columbia University for the first time in my life. So I'm glad you are here. So I'm going to be talking about the inequality in Mexico. This presentation is based on a report that I prepared for the NGO Oxfam, that you might know of it. Oxfam has prepared a couple of international reports on inequality in the world that are presented pretty much around the time of when the World Economic Forum meetings take place. And since then, based partially on the exit of those reports, they have started to prepare country studies on inequality. And the first study that they commissioned was the Mexican case, and they invited me to prepare the report, which is basically entitled "The Extreme Inequality in Mexico: The Concentration of Economic and Political Power." So the idea is basically it's not properly like a research paper. It's nothing really new on the presentation, on the data. I just collected information, just constructed like a narrative on inequality. There are a couple of parallel studies that sort of provide additional empirical evidence on what I'm going to be talking about, but the presentation will be focused mostly on the report, which is not that difficult to follow. It's basically prepared for a wider audience. So that's the idea of the presentation. Then is just to provide the general insights on the level of inequality in Mexico, the causes and some of the consequences of inequality in Mexico. It's just basically to provide a discussion on inequality in Mexico, which is a topic, by the way, that has been long postponed, has been considered like an issue that was not relevant a few years ago. As in many other parts in Latin America, there was a position that the mainstream was that instead of discussing inequality, we should discuss how to grow, and the share of the pie is not that relevant. Instead, we should focus on the size of the pie. So what we are trying to challenge is precisely that idea that we should focus also on the distribution of the pie and not just on the size of it. So let me start then with the first section of the document has this discussion on the magnitude of inequality in Mexico. Thank you. In comparative terms, just to give you an idea for those of you who might not know, it's difficult to compare inequality across countries for different reasons, including the fact that household surveys, which is the usual source of information for estimations of inequality, take place at a different time with different kind of questions. It's hard to make the comparisons. We have only two databases, I think, which are relatively trustable to make comparisons. One is the standardized world income inequality database. There, Mexico, the Gini coefficient, which is the standard measure to measure inequality, for Mexico is 0.44, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, the Gini coefficient, which is 0.37. In this ranking, Mexico is in the 87th place out of 113 countries. So 76% of the countries in the world, in the sample at least, have lower levels of inequality than Mexico. The second source of information is the World Development Indicators, the World Bank. There, Mexico has a Gini coefficient of 0.48. The Gini coefficient for the rest of the world is 0.40. So in this database, Mexico is in the 107th place out of 132 countries. In both cases, Mexico is within the 25% of countries with the highest levels of inequality in the world, according to this measure, which is the Gini coefficient, based on household service, and I'm going to also say something about that. But this is like the standard. If you look at what is the position of Mexico, Mexico is there, is in this group of countries with relatively large levels of inequality, as many other countries in Latin America. Now, the problem with this information, I mean, this is what we know. The problem with this is that this comes from household surveys, and information coming from household surveys has an important problem that we have been aware of for a few years, at least. And this is the fact that the Encuesta Nacional de Ingresos y Gastos de los Hogares, which is the standard survey that we use to estimate inequality, does not necessarily capture correctly the level of income of those at the top of the distribution. And this is something we knew. I mean, this is something which is true for all the countries in the world. It's hard for the surveys to capture this information, at least for two different reasons. One is, in some cases, even if they get to the rich people in the upper part of the distribution, it's hard for them to self-report the real level of income for different reasons, including security reasons or whatever you might want to think of. There is underreporting of income from these people if you are able to reach them. This is one reason. So underreporting is one. The other problem is that it's hard to reach them, precisely, in particular in cases like in Mexico, where they used to live in gated communities, in areas which is difficult to get access to them, or that you don't even get to cross beyond the security guard from where these people live, and so on and so forth. So it's hard. So we have two problems. One is underreporting, and second is which is called truncation. This is true for basically almost any household survey. So that's why we know now that these household surveys might underrepresent the level of income of people at the upper part of the distribution. So, what happens in other parts of the world? So this is precisely the argument why Piketty and others have started to look, instead of looking at household survey information, have started to look at other sources of information, particularly fiscal information. So fiscal sources are much better than self-reported information for obvious reasons. Of course, we still might have underreporting there, as we now know, precisely based on the Panama Papers that were leaked yesterday. We know that that might occur that, but at least we are confident that it's more precise probably than self-reported data in these household surveys. So Piketty and his co-authors have constructed this database using fiscal information. The problem with that is that in Mexico is the only OECD economy that where the Ministry of Finance has not been willing to make publicly available this information. So Mexico is the only country in Latin America that doesn't have this information available. So we cannot use fiscal sources to study this. We have learned recently, actually, that the INEGI, which is the Statistical Institute, has recently received information from Hacienda, from the Ministry of Finance, and they have started to incorporate this information into the estimations of inequality. Today, precisely, there was an interview with the president of INEGI, the new president, where he reported actually that. So we know that. So the problem then is that if we have this problem of underreporting and truncation, what is the real size of inequality in Mexico? So I already show you what the level of income inequality is using the Gini coefficient of these databases. So just to give you an idea why it is a problem. If you look at the national account, income per capita in Mexico is this continuous line over here. this is, I'm sorry, if you use national accounts, GDP per capita is the dashed line in the upper part. So it's growing in the past few years. I'm using information here from 1992 to 2014. So the income per capita has been increasing, slowly, but it has been increasing. It's pretty much at a rate close to 1% per year for the past 2 decades. But if we use the data from the household survey, what we find is this, is the continuous dynamic. So, which has been even diminishing. So this suggests one of two things. Either Mexicans are lying more often or more in these household surveys, or maybe those sources of income that usually are underreported in these household surveys have been increasing in the past few years. So that's a possibility. So these two things.
Do you trust the national accounts?
We trust national accounts. I mean, the national accounts have these different sources of information. They sort of match different available information coming from different sources. I pretty much trust the national accounts. At least the trend is fine. Maybe the level is different, but the trend, I think, makes sense. The fact that the income per capita has been growing at a rate close to 1%, I think is pretty much what everyone agrees. Mexico, I don't think there's much discussion about that. And that's why it is important to see what the difference when you use the household service information, which suggests that the economy is stagnant or even declining in the past 2 decades. So what we did, and this is a parallel paper, which I'm not presenting here today, but it's a parallel paper that I wrote with 2 of my co-authors, Raimundo Campos and Emmanuel Chavez, and we prepared a different paper where we try to use this information using a standard technique, one championed by Branko Milanovic, which is a very well-known economist from used to be part of the World Bank for a long period of time. He suggested a way to reconcile this information, a statistical technique. So we use that. Basically, what happens is we just take into account the fact that we have different sources of information, that this captures a trend that we believe in, and we should just inflate the household survey data using this gap between the 2 sources. Now, how exactly do we inflate? That's the problem. And there's different techniques to do that. Some institutions, like CEPAL, for example, uses to distribute all the difference more or less evenly across the population, which doesn't make too much sense. And actually, CEPAL is actually revising that. It doesn't make sense. So what we did, instead of another one, was just to distribute the difference using the observed distribution. This is an alternative, which is suggesting somehow that everyone in the reports pretty much at the same rate, which is not necessarily the case. So that's also not necessarily the best option, because that would suggest that people with lower levels of income underreport their income at pretty much the same rate as people with higher levels of income. That doesn't seem to make too much sense either. So what we did instead, and as I said, there are different options. What we did instead was to use information from 3 countries, Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay. And these 3 countries are interesting for different reasons, including the fact that are pretty much the same level of per capita income than Mexico. Second, have levels of income inequality similar to Mexico, with some differences. And for these 3 countries, we have the opportunity to have both sources of information: household survey information and fiscal sources. So we know what to do with the fiscal information just to be able to replicate, what to do with the household survey information just to be able to replicate what happens with the fiscal information. We know exactly what to do with these 3 countries because we have both sources of information. And so we combine the tax data with these 3 countries. And so we said, what do we need to do with the gap in income between what we know from the household surveys and what we know from national accounts? Which share of that should go to the top decile? Okay, that's the question that we ask ourselves. In one case, for example, in Chile, everything has to go to the top decile, all the gap in income, just to be able to replicate with the fiscal source, with the household surveys, what happens in the fiscal sources. Okay? In other countries, was 78% had to go to the top decile of the distribution. The average for these 3 countries was 83%, so we did that. So this is the average. This is 83% going to the top decile. The other 2 lines are just like we use a 5% window of distribution, and that doesn't change that much. So what we did is just a statistical method. This is important to understand. It's a statistical method just to be able to capture, to measure what the share of income going to the top decile in Mexico is without using tax information. Okay? But using what happens in other countries with similar levels of income, similar levels of equality. So these are the three distributions that we got. So it's alternative measures of the share of income going to the top decile of the distribution in Mexico. If you use the ENIC, but you find this, that in 1992, 50% of income was going to the top decile. Now, 43% is going to the top decile. When you make the adjustment that I just described, first of all, we start with a different level of income, 53% going to the top decile. Now, in average, 60% is going to top income. In the interview that was published today, the president of Inequality said that when they make the adjustment, they find that 50 percentage points of income additional go to the top decile of the distribution, which is pretty much along the lines that we have here. So we have that when instead of using the household survey data, which is 43%, we have 60% going, 70%, 17 percentage points additional going to the top decile. So this is just to give you an idea that our results are pretty much in line with what officially, at least the president of Inequality revealed today. These are not official data yet. But he gave this interview and he mentioned this data in an interview that was published precisely today. So this gives you an idea that our method, more or less, is in line with what they are finding, without using real fiscal sources, just using an estimation based on what happens in similar countries like these three countries that I just mentioned, Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay. And not only that, I mean, there's another researcher in Mexico from ITAM, Miguel del Castillo, who happens, I just found the research that he just published it in December, commissioned by CEPAL. And he did a different kind of approach, less statistical. Our approach was more statistical. His approach was more meticulously going to the sources of income from different groups of the population. And he estimates this. This is just to give you an idea what happens when he estimates. This is the official Gini coefficient using the ENIC, the household surveys. This is the Gini coefficient that he estimates when he includes income coming from property that is not being officially reported. And he has an alternative way of explaining how he incorporates that into his estimations. But what he gets is that a Gini coefficient goes to 65% from 0.53 instead of declining, as the household survey would suggest. So this is pretty much in line with what we have, although we didn't estimate Gini coefficients. We could, but we didn't do that. This is just to give you an idea of the sizes of the Gini coefficient that you reach. These are data coming from Miguel del Castillo, who is this author that I just mentioned before. These are 2010, 2012 data. Without adjustment, for example, 2012, using the household surveys, 0.45. Adjusting for different sources goes to 0.68, 0.73, 0.78. INEGI has also this data, this adjustment. They have started to do this adjustment, although this is not official data. These are data published by researchers at INEGI. They found pretty much Gini coefficients pretty much in line with what he finds. And just to give you an idea, the highest Gini coefficient published using household surveys is South Africa, 0.64. So that means we shouldn't compare that immediately, but just to give you an idea, what does it mean a level of Gini coefficient with this magnitude? This is not my estimates. This is the estimates of someone else. But I'm just presenting them because they are pretty much in line with what we just did. Just to give you let me just keep this. Now, the other thing we estimated was not just the share of the income going to the top decile, the share of income going to the 1%, which is this is the data that we have for different countries coming from the Piketty database, the World Income Top database. All of this data come from fiscal sources. We have Mexico right there at the bottom. This doesn't come from fiscal sources, but comes from this mechanism that I just described, this procedure. So combining this information. So in the case of Mexico, it's close to 21% of income going to the 1% at the upper part of the distribution. Again, just keep in mind this difference in the sources. this, let me just keep this. When we compare Mexico vis-a-vis other countries, the share of income going to the top 1%, using information from the top income database vis-a-vis our method, this is the evolution of these shares. For example, Argentina is over here, it's close to 21% or so. Mexico is the continuous line, which is always in the upper part of the distribution, much higher than other countries like UK, China, France, and so on and so forth. So when we are able to compare the share of income going to the 1%, to the top 1% Mexico, we find that based on this method, that there's a larger share going to this top 1%, people at the 1% distribution. Miguel del Castillo, I'm sorry just to keep bringing him in, but I was really excited when I saw his document because it's pretty much in line with what we have. We just using different sources of information. He finds that the 1% receives 24.9% of the income going to using his adjustments, which are, as I said, slightly different to ours because they are more based on the sources of income. So it's pretty much suggesting that the share of income going to the top 1% is probably among the largest for those countries for which we have information. Now, this is income. Something different is wealth. And for wealth, we don't have official data, as many countries do not have. But we have information from these wealth reports that are being published almost every year now. We have, for example, from the Global Wealth Report, we know that the richest 10% of people in Mexico, at least these are the estimates, the richest 10% of people in Mexico has almost 2/3 of total wealth in Mexico. And this is total wealth, including financial and non-financial assets. The Wealth Insight Report suggests that in Mexico, there are 145,000 individuals with more than $1 million net worth. And which is, just to give you an idea, 145,000 people in Mexico is much less, close to 0.1% of the population, including their families is less than 1% of the population. They have, according to these estimates, 43% of total wealth people. Which sort of more or less makes sense with the average for other countries, for the top 1% people in this group, is 29%. So which is pretty much in line, suggesting that in terms of income, 10% of people, using our adjustment, receive 60% of total income. In terms of wealth, 10% of income in Mexico, people in Mexico receive close to 2/3 of total wealth. In terms of 1% of the population, according to our estimates, receives 21% of income, and they have probably more than 43% of total wealth, which is it makes sense since we know that wealth used to be more concentrated than income. Okay. So this is just numbers that, as I said, we get from different sources and give you an idea of the level of inequality in Mexico. Now, we have a second section on this report on more specific group of people, particularly on the Mexican multimillionaires or the billionaires. Okay. So we look at Forbes, which is the standard source of information for this kind of analysis. Forbes, there are 16 Mexicans in this group, in this list. Pretty much the same number that we have had in the past 2 decades or so. Just to give you an idea, in terms of what has happened, so the number of rich people from Mexico in this list is pretty much the same, but the level of wealth has really surged in the past few years. The average wealth of each member went from 1.7 billion to almost $9 billion in this period. Even if we adjust by inflation, this is a significant increase. So just to give you an idea, in the real terms, their wealth multiplied by 4 in a period in which income per capita in Mexico increased close to 20% or so, 25% at the most. What does that mean? Well, that means that if we compare the share of, and I know the criticism that some have been subject to by comparing stock with flows, but we can adjust that easily. But the idea is pretty much the same. The share of wealth of these millionaires compared to the level of GDP in Mexico. We just focus on 4. Why 4? Because these 4 are those who are permanently in this list, which are the 4 richest people in Mexico. Carlos Slim, which is the line in the middle here. three others, Germán Larrea, Alberto Balleres, and Salinas Piego. He was prominently displayed in this Panama paper, by the way. And this is the fourth, the addition of this, so the fourth. And they have moved from having a total wealth which was close to 2% of GDP in Mexico at the end of last century. Now they have close to 9% of income. That's because the wealth has increased much more rapidly than GDP. Even if we move from here to flows, that is pretty much still the same, which is that. So let me skip that. Now, what do they have in common? Well, we argue, and we can discuss that this is like a political argument, that this group of people, in particular in Mexico, have made their wealth based on either from privatized sectors, as Carlos Slim did. He was the beneficiary of the privatization of Telmex, as you might know. Either by concessions, like Germán Larrea and Alberto Balleres, who are in the mining sector, or for combination of all these, like Ricardo Salinas Pliego, who also received, he was the beneficiary of, he gained the control of a national TV network 2 decades ago, and they all participate in sectors which are supposed to be regulated by the state, or that they receive concession from the state. So all of them have made their fortunes basically linked to the state somehow, and and they have benefited from a lax tax system or from poor regulation. And this is not just my judgment; it's just what the OECD published a few years ago. He published a study, for example, where they say that Carlos Slim, the fact that was not regulated properly Telmex during the 2005-2009 period generated a loss of well-being for the Mexicans close to 1.8% of annual GDP. So that's the loss in welfare, well-being for the Mexicans as a result of the high tariffs that someone like Carlos Slim, who had the monopoly on telecommunications, actually overcharged Mexicans. Okay, this is a study from the OECD that was very publicized in Mexico, and so on. So during all this period there was lack of competition, high market concentration, and the authority was very lax in terms of the regulation that they had to implement for tariffs from the company owned by Slim. The mining sector case has also benefited a lot from this tax system. Mexico is the only mining country, actually, where there was no, until last year, by the way, there was no tax on royalties in Mexico. So you get the concession to exploit a mining segment of the land in Mexico, and you can exploit it. You have to pay income tax, but you don't have to pay royalties in Mexico. You didn't have to pay for all this period. And I'm doing this just to give you an idea what does that mean. Remember that we are coming out from a commodity boom period. During the 2000-2010 period, they were given so many concessions in Mexico that during this period was produced more than twice the tons of gold that were extracted from the mines in Mexico over 300 years of the Virreinato in Mexico. So just in the last decade, we're given so many concessions, many of them going to these people that I just mentioned, and they have benefited a lot, and they didn't pay taxes, or at least not royalty taxes on that. The fiscal system is one that benefits a lot to bring the people with the higher levels of income, because the level of income doesn't really tax the main sources of income for the rich people. Which one is the most important? Well, probably the most important is capital gains. Here in the US, we always have this discussion, and there's always this discussion going on, in terms of the gap between the income tax, which is maybe 30-40% for some people, and the capital gains tax, which is 15%. This is the discussion that promoted Warren Buffett, for example, when he said that his secretary used to pay a higher proportion of their income than himself. That's because of the gap in the income tax vis-a-vis the capital gains tax. Well, until last year, capital gains tax in Mexico was zero, completely zero. So you didn't pay, and now it's not zero, but in practice it's actually zero. It's so badly designed that nobody actually pays that tax. And I submitted a transparency request of information to see how much they had collected, they have not given the information, but I know informally that they basically collected nothing. So, so there is no capital gains tax. There is no inheritance tax. As you know, in many countries exist this inheritance tax. Some countries is as high as 50% for the top part of the distribution. In Mexico, there is no zero tax. There are no property value taxes, and so on. If you look at the highest marginal rate on tax income, Mexico is over here. It's the country on the OECD with the lowest marginal tax rate on income. If you look at dividends, Mexico is the second to last country with the highest level with the lowest level of tax rate on dividends, and so on and so forth. So, so we have this also. So, I mean, this fiscal system is not taxing the rich, basically. So that's what happens. And what happens with this? Well, we know that what happens with the non-Latin American OECD countries, when tax and transfers enter into place, this is the Gini coming from the market. This is the Gini after tax and transfers. So there's a significant contraction. Instead, in Latin American countries, including Mexico, which is right here, the contraction is very minimal, as you can see. So reduces inequality, not that much. First of all, look at inequality generated by the market is higher in Mexico than in the rest of the OECD economies, the non-Latin American countries. And this is because in these other countries, probably the distribution of, for example, human capital is better distributed. So this is the result of pre-tax and transfers. But after tax and transfers, it doesn't do that much to the Gini coefficient in Mexico, whereas in other countries like Europe, for example, reduces inequality.
Clarification.
Yeah.
After tax and transfers, those are taxes that it could be applied, or actual taxes?
Actual taxes.
Actual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actual taxes and actual transfers. Yeah. So I can get on this. This has implications in terms of the functional distribution of income has been biased now towards capital instead of labor. Those of you who have studied the Cobb-Douglas production function know that we always are taught that the alpha, which is the parameter in the production function, is the share of income going to labor, or to capital, I'm sorry, is 1/3, and whereas the rest is going to labor, it's 2/3. In Mexico, it's exactly the opposite to begin with. So we have the Douglas-Cobb production function, which is exactly the opposite. And not only that, that has been increasingly going to capital, which now receives 73% of total income, whereas labor receives only 27%. So this is slight positive trend for capital, a slight negative trend for labor. So this has to do with all this, what I'm just describing. So let me just move into this. What are the consequences of this? We discussed this in the paper. I feel like I'm getting out of time. But I want to mention at least one thing, which is inequality and growth. Inequality and growth, there is a study by someone from the OECD, Singano. He estimated a paper where he estimated the effect of inequality on growth. And he concludes that in case of Mexico, the GDP could have grown by 10% more had not been by the level of inequality that Mexico, not the level, the increase in inequality that Mexico had in the past 2 decades. So, so inequality could play a role in terms of diminishing growth because we have a weak domestic market, affects decisions of individuals in terms of human capital accumulation, and so on and so forth. Now, but more importantly, I think, is the fact that the growth that we generate is not just lower for the reasons I just mentioned, but also this growth that we have had, small as it could be, 1% per year in the past 2 decades, is non-inclusive. That means that has not affected poverty rates in Mexico. So if you look at the poverty rates in Mexico today, and you look at the poverty rate, these are official data, by the way, official data. Today, and the official poverty rates in 1992, which is when we started collecting this data, is pretty much the same. 53% of the population lives in poverty in Mexico, according to the official data. Almost 1/5 of the population lives in extreme poverty condition. That means, living in extreme poverty condition, food poverty is called, that means that those families do not have enough income to be able to buy a basket of goods that would provide the minimal nutrients to have a healthy life. that's being extremely poor in Mexico. Well, 1/5 of the population lives in this extreme poverty situation. This is true today. If we now have an additional data, which is not here, but it's 20%. This is pretty much the same that we had back in 1990. Poverty is exactly the same, 53% here. So even though we have had growth in the past few years, and even though these poverty lines are established in absolute terms, this growth has not reduced poverty. If you think that what would happen if the benefits of that growth would have been distributed evenly across the distribution, you could have imagined that some people could have gotten out of poverty. Well, that hasn't really happened. We might discuss this. Of course, there is a demographic effect and so on and so forth. But in general, has not been this growth able to reduce poverty in Mexico. And that's because the growth that we are generating, the benefits of growth, have been captured actually by the upper part of the distribution, basically. And mostly by people in the top 10%, as I showed you before, and mostly by people in the top 1%. And just to give you an idea, just an example of that, minimum wages in Mexico. This is the evolution of minimum wages in Mexico. Just to say that minimum wage in Mexico today is 1/4 of what it used to be almost 40 years ago, 1976. You might claim that that year was an excessive minimum level, whatever. But it is now 1/3 of what it used to be in the 60s. The period of stabilization in Mexico, low levels of inflation, and so on. So you cannot claim that this is the result of the evolution of productivity, unless you think Mexicans are now 1/3 productive as they used to be 40 years ago. So, and not only that, this is a graph that I just took from a presentation from the central bank that presented last week, which is interesting because this is the same thing, the evolution of minimum wage, this is the blue line. But these lines right here, the red line is the line that separates people from living in poverty or not. The green line is the line separating people living in extreme poverty situation. This is for a family of 2. So if you earn a minimum wage in Mexico, you are not only well below the poverty line, but even now you are even below the extreme poverty line. So you happen to have this is important because people used to think that poor people in countries like Mexico is because they don't get a job. Even if you get a job, even if you get a formal job, even if you work 8 hours, you could be not just poor, but even extremely poor. That's because the minimum wage in Mexico is so low.
By family of 2, you mean 2 children?
No, this is to one person. So my earning the minimum wage, and he has to has someone that depends on one person. So that's what he's supposed to do. Now, just to give you an additional idea of what has happened to the very rich people in Mexico and what happens to the people earning minimum wage, I decided to do an estimation based on idea suggested by Branko Milanovic. Branko Milanovic, again, he has this, which actually goes back all the way to Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote in the Wealth of Nations that the level of richness of someone has to be measured depending on the number of people that person can command on. Okay, so that was the definition of Adam Smith. Branko Milanovic asked himself, how can we estimate who is the richest person in history? Well, let's see how many people can they hire. Well, I did pretty much the same exercise, but asking not just how many people can these rich people can hire, but how many people they can hire, paying them the minimum wage in Mexico. But not asking how many people they can hire with their wealth, but with the return on their wealth. Okay? That means that at the end of the year, they could be as rich as they were at the beginning. They were just using the real return on their wealth. I assume a real return of 5%, which is well below the average for people with these levels of fortunes. If you look at data on Piketty. So 5% return on wealth. How many Mexicans could they hire? Well, again, Carlos Slim, the other 3, the 4 billionaires. At the turn of the century, they could hire, in all, close to 500,000 Mexicans, paying them the minimum wage. Their wealth has increased so much, hire 3 million Mexicans, paying them the minimum wage. If you think how many Mexicans are 3 million, a lot of people, of course. But this is larger than the number of unemployed people in Mexico. The total number of unemployed people in Mexico is 2.3 million. Okay? They could hire everyone and pay them a minimum wage, and they could still have resources to hire 700,000 more. And at the end of that, they would be as rich as they were at the beginning. Okay? This is just to give you an idea of two things in just one graph. How rich they are, and how low is the minimum wage in Mexico. So I have other sections, but I just there is some other sources of inequality or discrimination. One is against indigenous people. Indigenous people in Mexico has an extreme poverty rate which is 4 times that of the rest of the population, for example. So this is indigenous total population. The comparison is even biased because this is not non-indigenous population. This includes indigenous population, which is close to 10%. But still, this is just the bias. But just to give you an idea, it's 4 times the percentage of people of indigenous origin being in extreme poverty situation vis-a-vis people from the total population. So this gives you an idea of how inequality is also particularly affecting certain groups of the population. We also have a discussion on gender inequality, which is also an important issue in terms of, but this is well known everywhere, in terms of income, opportunities, and so on and so forth. I just want to skip all these. So I just want to say one last thing, and I stop. In terms of, just to give you an idea how this inequality, it is not the result of something coming out of the blue. It's not natural. So it's something that is designed and embedded in public policies. In last administration, we had this change in fiscal policies that gave deductions on tuition, school tuition in general, and transportation to school and so on. Who benefits from this, from a policy like this? Well, most people that benefit from this are people in the top decile of the distribution. 98% of people giving donations belong to the top decile. 96% spends money on school transportation. Almost 90% spends on tuition in private schools. So those are the ones who benefit from this fiscal deduction. At the same time that we have these deductions on incentivizing people to send their kids to private schools, at the same time, last year was released, finally, a survey on the situation of public schools in Mexico. And the situation of public schools in Mexico, just to give an idea, 48% of all schools in Mexico do not have access to sewage, 31% do not have access to drinking water, 13% do not have bathroom, 11% do not have electricity, 61% do not have access to working affairs, 80% do not have access to it. So this is the situation of public schools, and at the same time, we are giving fiscal benefits to all those who send people to the school. So we don't even invest on the very basic. And of course, doing this, what this finally doing is just exacerbating the initial differences between people that cannot send their kids to private schools and those who can actually send people to private schools. So this is just, again, just to give you an idea of that this is not the result of just the market. It's also the result of public policy. And one last thing, which I just mentioned because I think many people might be interested in this. Inequality is also related to violence and criminality and insecurity. There are at least two recent papers. One is by Enamorado, Lopez Calva, and others, was just published, where they show that that an increase in Gini coefficient at the municipal level is associated with an increase in deaths per population in the municipality, but particularly with deaths related to drug trafficking, to organized crime, basically. And the second study by Corona Juarez, it's a doctoral thesis, he shows that levels of criminal activity and homicides in Mexico are significantly associated with low levels of education among young people and high rates of youth unemployment, as you might imagine. I mean, these factors are like a precondition for people and deciding to enter and participate into all activities related to the organized crime in Mexico. So it's also related inequality to this situation of insecurity and violence in Mexico. So this is the report. We have a section on policies that we recommend, that we think we might discuss that. This is just our policies based on how do we need to change if we really want to we really care about the levels of inequality in Mexico, and we think that this is something that should not exist for different reasons, including either purely normative reasons, moral and so on, or even economic reasons, thinking that improving the distribution of income might also help to strengthen the internal market, for example, or even for social and political reasons, just to increase cohesion, social cohesion in Mexico. You might want to be interested in that. And we have recommendations there, but which are the standard recommendations, which is increase taxes in a progressive way, better expenditure, focalized to improve performance, and investing a lot in the poorest states in Mexico, which are the southern states in Mexico, which is where the newest population lives, and so on. So it's a program based. It's pretty much along standard based, just suggesting to invest better and to invest in people and to reduce inequality, making this progressive fiscal system, taking care of both taxes on the one side and spending on the other side. Because as I showed you before, that's an area where we have a lot of opportunity to increase the reduction in inequality by targeting better both taxes and spending in different social programs. So there's a discussion on that. But this is pretty much what I wanted to present. We have also a discussion on transparency and accountability by asking people, asking all those participating in different branches of government to reveal the statements of wealth, conflict of interest, and income taxes. And we also have a discussion on wage and labor policy, including minimum wage policy and so on, and a labor reform that could actually improve the abilities of workers and unions to be represented, or to represent the interests of workers, and not what we have now, which is something that is not working in that direction. So, but this is just like a policy set of recommendations, a set of policy recommendations to reduce inequality. But this is pretty much what I wanted to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you two questions related
Sure.
to this, and we'll open it for the floor. There are two characteristics of Mexico well known. One is informality, and the other one is the dependence on the U.S. Okay, and there are several studies showing the correlation between growth in the U.S. and growth in Mexico. So, and you showed us the graph on the evolution of poverty. And I think implicit was there a relationship between poverty and growth, that it was an inclusive growth. Now, there was a drop in poverty, of course, after the 1994 crisis, but it was going down in 2008 when the crisis in the US breaks out. So I was wondering, is that where we are? Right, exactly. I think it was another, no, poverty rates, maybe it was this one. This one, for example. So it goes up after 2008.
Yeah.
So it may not have to do with the characteristics of Mexico, but with the crisis in the US. That's one thing. And the other thing is when you estimated the income inequality or the Gini coefficients, taking into account the data from Colombia, Chile, and Uruguay, using fiscal data, I think that these countries have less informality than Mexico. So I was wondering if that wasn't a bit over, too much of an assumption.
Okay, that's
I mean, those are the two comments that I have. I don't know if you
so.
want
How
to
do I respond to those?
Yeah,
that's right.
and then we will.
Yeah, of course, as you can see here, poverty has a business cycle component, of course. Like, when we had this crisis in 1994, the so-called tequila crisis, poverty increased substantially, as you can see here. And then we had a period of recovery in the economy that also was accompanied by a reduction in poverty. But even there, you can see that there is like a threshold that is hard to move from that. In terms of food poverty, the lower level was in 2006, which was close to 15%. In terms of the asset poverty, or the poverty, total poverty, was close to 43%. And they increased. Partially, this increase is important. Why this increase occurred not that much for what happened in the U.S. economy, not for what happened in the macro level economy, but what happened with the price of food in Mexico, of these commodities in Mexico, of food in general, that it started to increase much more rapidly. And this you can see that in the graph of the minimum wage. When this starts to separate this gap between the minimum wage, which was being targeted using the national price, the average consumer price index. But if you look at the level of poverty line is based on the food basket, and that is actually this. So what I'm just saying is that minimum wages and wages in general have been kept at the level depending on the average inflation, just keep them in real terms. But at the same time, what we have had is, if you remember what happened in the economy, in the global economy at that time, was an increase in foods that was pretty much more substantial. And that in part increases, explains particularly this increase and probably something like this over here. So it has a cyclical component, a business cycle component, but it's not that much. It's very resilient. The important thing here is there seems to be like a threshold that is very hard to pass, which doesn't make that much sense in terms that in all these 20, at least in this graph, 2-decade period, the economy has been growing. So why is that? I mean, the main question that we should still ask ourselves is, why is that despite the fact that the economy grew in these 2 decades, we were not able to reduce poverty beyond the levels that we started in 1992, which are not low levels. I mean, you can argue that probably in some cases it's very hard to fight poverty because it's people that live in very extreme conditions in the mountains and so on. That could be probably the case of food poverty. It is not that obvious that that argument can apply to total poverty, because we're talking about more than half of the population. So it is something else, I think, which is entrenched in structurally, that despite the fact that we have been able to grow, that doesn't. I mean, there is no. As it called the effect, el efecto de goteo, trickle down effect. Despite the fact that the economy has grown, there is no trickle down. So nothing is actually, well, except for this period, but we were coming from a very high level of poverty, which was the outcome of this crisis in 1995. There is no trickle down effect in terms of the economy. So there is no benefit for people in the lower part of the distribution of the fact that the economy as a whole is wrong. So that's my question. There is a part of that. Now, in terms of the other question, which is the informality, yes, Mexican economy is characterized by a higher share of informality than many other economies in Latin America. Official estimates from Inequality says that we have 2/3 of people working informally. So this is a characteristic. Why is that? There are many discussions on why is that, including the regulation and so on. The question, I mean, as I understand, the question was whether that characteristic of the Mexican economy does not affect the comparison that we did,
Exactly.
which is important. Maybe partially, because these economies that we use to compare have large shares of informality, but not that as high as in Mexico. The critical assumption here is how are they distributed? Probably, of course, people in informality are being distributed with having an overrepresentation of people in the lower part of the distribution, maybe. This is what we know. But all the data, since are coming from, when we use fiscal sources, we underrepresent people in the lower parts of the distribution. When we use total income, which as in household surveys, or total national representative survey, like the household survey, supposedly, as I said, captures the whole distribution regardless of their labor status, formal or informal. So the combination of that is sort of I think, and I think that explains why the results from Inequality are pretty much similar to ours. That it is probably a good combination in terms that we are still keeping the information coming from the household survey, which is probably representing well or capturing well what's going on at the lower part of the distribution. And we are adding people from the upper part of the distribution that was not capturing the household survey, but that using information that comes from these other fiscal sources from other countries. So we have a combination of groups of people. When Inequality, this is interesting because when Inequality started to incorporate the fiscal sources, what they thought is that using only fiscal sources was better than combining the two sources of information. What they found when they used only fiscal sources was exactly what you said, that they underrepresented people in the lowest part of the distribution. They had a huge inequality, but a huge level of average income in Mexico, which didn't make sense. And they realized that they had to combine the two sources. And that's what they are doing now. So, so I think that what we did is something sort of middle of the ground that by chance, because we didn't think about that, to be honest, by chance happened to be probably the best combination of information, which is people from the lower part of the distribution is well represented in the household survey. People in the upper part of the distribution is probably better represented by other sources, including fiscal sources. So this is just my argument why I would defend our estimates, despite the fact that are not actual estimates based on fiscal sources.
Let me collect some questions. The gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd just like your thoughts on the interrelationship of immigrants in the United States, legal, illegal, in terms of the money they earn, and how that affects the kind of topology you're offering here, and maybe your thoughts on these sort of xenophobic debates that are happening in the United States on this.
Let me collect two more here. And then, yeah.
Okay. So your presentation shows how wealth and income distribution both have got a lot worse in the last years, and you seem to think that it has to do with the fiscal system. So you showed a very interesting graph with inequality after tax and yeah. So do you have data of how that has changed? And do you have an idea of if inequality, if after taxation and what's the other? Transfers. After taxation and transfers, that difference has got a lot worse as well in the last 15 years or so?
Let me get one more, and yeah.
According to what you showed, I would think that Piketty would characterize our society, like Mexican society, as a patrimonialist society, and it pretty much fits the story you were developing here. But it is not clear to me whether it would also hold true that this tax policy is the main driver behind, for instance, the 1 minus alpha returns on labor. Would you say that is the main cause, like tax policy, in regards to how capital endowment per worker has evolved, and how does that relate to productivity and the big informal sector, a little bit building on what has been said?
Okay.
You remember?
Yeah.
I'll help you.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'll go first with the question on migrants and in what effect that might have on equality. I didn't show them here, but I have a paper, different paper, on the evolution of inequality in Mexico after now. And that's slightly different to what I just presented here, because that's using only household survey information. But there, I was able to disentangle what the contribution of different factors was to inequality. And remittances, which is the sources of income from all those migrants, actually have contributed substantially to the reduction of inequality. So other things being equal, the fact that there are so many migrants in the US, and that they usually come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that they come from, many of them from the rural areas, which is where the people is poor in Mexico. So the remittances they send, in general, has had two effects. One is that's contributed to reduce poverty significantly, particularly in rural areas. And second, has reduced inequality because it's income that goes to people in the lower part of the migrants' remittances with poverty and inequality is one that has helped to reduce poverty and inequality, and that not having that would have would generate much worse indicators in both terms of both poverty and inequality. But that's what we know, and that this is a different paper that I wrote a few years ago, and I have 2 papers precisely on that. So if you want, I can give you more information on that paper, on that kind of studies. But this was just using household surveys, not wondering about income coming from capital property, which is which I'm focusing here. So this is one question. The second question from this, the role of tax and transfers and what has been the evolution of that. Well, I'm not claiming that it's just tax and it's just the system of the fiscal system, including both taxes and transfers. That has played a role, and that has not changed significantly in the past few years. So, so that cannot explain the increase in wealth, for example, for those people in the upper class. So it has to be something else, including the fact that they have been able to negotiate better conditions for their sectors, for their firms, and so on. But the fiscal system doesn't help. So that was my point. The fiscal system doesn't help. And the graph I show you actually is not my graph. It's a graph that comes from a study from the OECD. And the person who has been studying this and what the role of taxes and transfer has been and the evolution of that is Nora Lustig. Nora has now a very recent study. Nora has a project which is wonderful because it's worldwide a project now on the role of taxes and transfer and how that explains inequality in many countries. I think she just received a grant from Bill Gates, paradoxically, to study all these issues of inequality. And she now has been able to map what the role of these modifications in taxes and transfer has been in terms of Gini coefficients after taxes and transfers and so on. Now, the problem with that, I mean, having said that this is wonderful and excellent, and I think it's going to be generating interesting results, the problem with that is that I think it has not incorporated fully this criticism to the household survey information, which is the fact that that's fine, but that basically concentrates on labor income, not on capital income, because that's what it is much more easily comparable across countries. Okay? Because the household surveys are designed precisely to capture that part of it. If you see many of these studies that use household survey, do not even use capital income at all. So that's part of the problem that I see with this. But if any is going to give you some information on that, it's going to be the study by Nora Lustig, which has wonderful papers on that, comparing different countries in Latin America. There is a website. It's I don't remember exactly what does that mean, but it's the Commission on Equality, Fiscal System and something, CEPQS something.
Commitment to equity. Commitment to equity.
That's right. Commitment to equity, but something else, right?
Something else.
Commitment to Equity is a website, and where you have all these wonderful papers by Nora. Wow.
For the case of Argentina, she found
Yeah.
that it was a big, I don't know, here we have an expert on Argentina, maybe he can tell us a little bit more about it.
So, in terms of the last question was on...
The last question had to
Oh, yes,
Productivity.
yeah. Yes, about the functional distribution of income. Yes. Yes, part of that has to do with low investment in capital. Yeah, of course. I mean, capital per worker is very low. Has not, and there I would Jaime Ross has written substantially about that. So part of the reasons behind Jaime Ross has a study on that and has tried to explain this pattern that I just showed you by sectors. So part of that has to do with low levels of investment in sectors, but part of that he's not able to explain. And part of that, I claim, that something that has to be done, has to do with the political economy issues in terms of distribution. How do you distribute income in terms of what part is going to wages, what part is going to property income? And I think the explanation lies probably more on the structure of the representation of workers in Mexico. To give you an idea, so how strange is the representation of workers in Mexico? Last year there was not a single strike in Mexico, and I think that's something that has to be studied carefully, because it is strange that an economy with these levels of poverty, levels of inequality, that does not translate into labor movement much stronger than the one we had. And that has to do with the story of how the labor movement was constructed in Mexico, the corporativism in Mexico, and some of the things which I don't know that much. Probably here there are people that know much better than I do. But also with the labor reform that we have and how workers are represented. So there is no real representation of labor workers because the law is such that allows for a fake representation of workers, and in the end, that there is no like a space. And Robert Solow, by the way, has an interesting discussion on that, a very recent discussion, where he says, well, as someone has used the Cobb Douglas and has argued about this, I now recognize, as he says, that there is an area in which there is like a political economy discussion on how the benefits of income are distributed between capital and labor. So he has an interesting discussion on that. And I think that's something that's happening in Mexico. Part of that is the result of the structure of the economy, the low levels of capital and so on. But part of that has to do probably with the representation of workers and the ability that they have to be able to demand a larger share of income, despite the fact that they are generating probably the gross of this income. So I think that has to do with some other discussion that we still need to have.
Thank you. We have one here, and then we'll go back.
I was more interested in the part that you're talking about, the political economy. How can these workers or the people that represent these workers demand from these decision makers this transfer of budget or of welfare? How can you measure how do these people get benefited from the decision makers, as in policy or in projects? And also, how do you measure social cohesion?
I wonder, what do you think about the actual debate about the drop of inequality in Latin America linked to the skip premium? What do you think about, if you agree or not with this optimism linked to the last decade in the region?
So I'm from Brazil, in which inequality decreased in a faster pace than other countries in Latin America, partially because of Bolsa Familia, cash transfer program. So I'd like to ask about the role of oportunidades in inequality in Mexico, and if you could compare it with other cash transfer programs within Latin America.
Okay. I mix these two together because I think they are related, yeah. and that's interesting because I was part of that optimistic way.
Yeah, I know.
So I wrote a paper
with Lopez
Calva and Nora Lustig originally. When I started studying these issues, I wrote this optimistic paper on the dynamics of inequality after NAFTA. So, but I actually in this report I explain why do they both make sense.
Yeah.
And the reason is that all those papers, including those that explain what happened in Brazil and in other countries, and this optimistic view on the evolution of inequality in Latin America, basically all of them focus on labor income, basically, or no, I would say non-capital income. Mm-hmm. So that means labor income and transfers, and so. And that's why, when you measure that, the role of social programs like Progresa in Mexico or Bolsa Familia in Brazil have contributed to the reduction of that inequality being measured only not including capital income. So, but when you include capital income, the story changes. Yeah. And that's true of Mexico. This is what I sort of tried to show. And that's true of Brazil too. Yeah. There's this recent paper by, I think it's Medeiros, which is pretty much along the lines that I just showed you, where he sort of adjusts the household survey information using national accounts information, and he finds precisely the same thing. I mean, that there is a change not just on the level of inequality, but in the trend as well. So the story, the happy story of the role of, in the case of Mexico, remittances, and the role of social programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil and Progress in Mexico, which contribute to reducing inequality, it still holds, but only when you focus on non-capital income. When you focus on the sources of information that are captured by household sources. So that's fine, and the optimistic view is there, and that has contributed probably to a better distribution of that kind of income. when you add labor capital income is when the story changes. So this is something that we should keep in mind.
So there is where you will find the largest differentials.
Exactly. And
So they let us
So the
that,
bottom line.
the
and
ones
that,
with the
and that it is so important.
Sure.
It is so important
Sure.
is that when you add up the whole thing, the evolution is actually doubles. So the bottom line is, in any case, is that it's fine. I mean, these social programs have contributed to reduce poverty and inequality, but not enough as to compensate for the other trends that we are observing. At least in the case of Mexico and Brazil. I don't really know the context, but at least in the case of Mexico and Brazil, we now know that the evolution of capital income is so concentrated that has been leading to an increase in inequality. Okay, so just to make that clear. And the other question was
Actually, it was from here.
Oh,
Social cohesion.
you asked
right?
one question which is very important, which is how do you measure social cohesion?
Yeah.
I mean, Mexican government has been debating that for years because I don't know exactly how to measure that. But the Mexican government doesn't know either. In the law, in the development law that we have in Mexico, it was established that the measurement of multidimensional poverty should include a dimension of social cohesion. And well, there was, I think, 7 lines of 7 indicators. So far, the government has been able to agree on 6 of them, except for the social cohesion. You see, it is not clear how to measure them. There have been many proposals, one including actually things related to violence, to insecurity. Others have suggested more in terms of socioeconomic indicators like similarity of disparity of the inverse of polarization, the polarization index that the Rash suggested at some point, things like that. So there's no agreement on how to measure that, and I don't feel like confident enough to suggest one. I think they have both advantages and disadvantages. It's hard to measure that. So that's the only thing I would say. But the discussion it depends on what do you think is the most important thing in terms of social cohesion, whether socioeconomic or other dimensions, including security and violence. So, and I don't know, to be honest, what the answer to that question is.
What about the concentration of political power?
Well, and the other thing, this is part of the narrative that I just described, and this is the narrative of the Oxfam in general, which is the fact that it is not just the concentration of economic power, but the reason that why we should be concerned about is also because that implies concentration of political power, and that's being represented in terms of the kind of policies that they form. So, in the case of Mexico, it's pretty clear how rich people has been able to influence the design of public policies in different dimensions. You might think of, since they're talking about the energy reform, for example, but many other reforms that we have had in the past few years. So I think there is a connection between concentration of economic power and political power. This is part of the discussion that we had. It is much better developed in the Oxfam report in general, but I think that's part of this. That's why they have been able to block, for example, some taxes, like the inheritance taxes. I mean, they don't just have enough power just to block anything like this in Congress. It's not even discussed at all. So things like that. So economic power goes hand in hand with political power and public policy power as well.
Let me get 2 more questions. Yes. Go ahead.
This is more general question, trying to be optimistic. Are there the international tendency, for example, the fact that the ticket book has been such a huge success everywhere, could that be influencing the political discussion to be able to change things and bring these reforms forward in Mexico?
And the last one, if it's short, and
Yeah,
that's
well,
it.
my question is more oriented towards how do you account for corruption in terms of there is evidently a growth in the wealth of these concentrated people. There's also a lot of scandals in terms of the public debts of states, corruption of governors in states. So is there an increase in the public expenditure that has not been translated and can be, I don't know, perhaps assumed that it is lost to corruption and that it is also affecting these inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, that's critical. I mean, the issue of corruption is critical. It's critical precisely by this study where economic power translates into political power, because a lot of that capture of the political power goes to corruption. And that's why part of the discussion that I had at the end with the proposals part of that has to do with that. I mean, in terms of transparency and accountability, at least a little bit of it, which is just requesting transparency in terms of public officials revealing what their level of wealth is, what their conflict of interest they have in terms of the companies in which they have interest or have invested in the past and so on, and their fiscal declaration. So, so this is something we suggested in this document a few months ago, and now there is a law, an initiative that has been presented to the Mexican Congress, with a number of citizens, I think it's now close to 400,000, have signed a petition to include that as a law, so that all public servants have to reveal these three sources of information. It seems like there is like a political agreement that at least two of them will be approved, the patrimony and probably the fiscal, their conflict of interest. It is not obvious that the fiscal declaration is going to be available, publicly available. That there is a good discussion on that, but at least there will be some advance in that, which doesn't eliminate corruption, of course, but at least might disincentivate people to participate in the public government, in the government, if they are pretending to make some fishy businesses. So, so I don't know, but at least this is part of the. This is the only thing that we think we can do at this stage. So just asking for more transparency and so on and so forth, and accountability. In terms of the Piketty question, I think that's why we are discussing this. I mean, these issues now. I mean, it actually changed my point of view. As I said, I had an optimistic view before that. When I started thinking about what he said, I changed my view and so on. But I'm still optimistic in the sense that I think that has not only changed the discussion in these other terms, but he also has opened this discussion, and I think in this regard, this issue that happened yesterday with the Panama Papers goes pretty much into that direction. It's very important for that reason, I said, because part of the argument of Piketty was not just inequality, but how to fight against inequality. And all his argument, and in the end, if you look at the last chapters of his book, is all the discussion on a global approach to taxation, and a discussion on fiscal habits and so on and so forth. How much wealth is being translated from all these countries to these fiscal habits, and therefore they are not paying taxes and so on and so forth. That was followed by Gabriel Zuckman, who wrote this wonderful book. It's a small book. It's The Hidden Wealth of Nations, where he estimated that 8% of total wealth in the world is in this fiscal paradise. So the revelation yesterday of these transactions of all these wealthy people, I think will help to this discussion in terms of what is needed. And what is needed is precisely a global tax where you have to punish somehow all these countries that have benefited a lot from these fiscal secrecies and so on, and are contributing to erode the tax basis of all these other countries in the world. So there have been some some improvements. For example, the FATCA is precisely going to that direction. The OECD has suggested mechanisms and procedures to go in terms of generating this global taxation information. And that's critical if you want to tax, maybe we don't want to, but if we want to tax wealth, that's the way to go. Otherwise, if we want to tax wealth at the single country level, it's going to be very hard while we have all these fiscal habits. So that's why I think it's so important what happened yesterday, because I think it might generate this global idea of the need to fight against that, precisely.
Well, thank you very much. This has been wonderful.